They called it a water purification plant. That's what the sign said, that's what the locals were told. Just a lumber mill and research facility in the frozen forests of Manchuria, staffed by Japanese scientists working to keep soldiers healthy. Nothing to worry about, nothing to see. But at night, the screams carried on the wind, screams that didn't sound human anymore, screams that would suddenly stop, cut short by something worse than death. And in the morning, the smokestacks would belch thick, greasy smoke that smelled like burning meat. The local Chinese villagers learned not to ask questions. The ones who got too curious disappeared. What was really happening inside those walls was beyond imagination. A factory of death disguised as science. Human beings, men, women, children, strapped to tables, cut open while still conscious, frozen alive, infected with diseases, and dissected like laboratory rats. All in the name of research. All with meticulous documentation. All completely sanctioned by the Japanese Imperial Army. This was Unit 731, and by the time World War II ended, between 200,000 and 300,000 people had been tortured to death inside its facilities. But here's the thing that should make your blood run cold. The men responsible were never punished. They never faced trial at Nuremberg. They never went to prison, because the United States government gave them immunity in exchange for their data. This is the story the world tried to forget. The atrocity that was buried beneath the rubble of Hiroshima and the horrors of the Holocaust. The war crime so disturbing that even 70 years later, Japan refuses to fully acknowledge it happened. This is Unit 731, and what you're about to hear is worse than you can possibly imagine. Chapter 1. The Architect of Hell. To understand Unit 731, you must first understand the man who created it. His name was Shiro Ishii, and he was a monster disguised as a genius. Born in 1892 to a wealthy family, Ishii was brilliant. He graduated from Kyoto Imperial University, one of Japan's most prestigious schools, with a degree in medicine. He was charismatic, ambitious, and utterly without conscience. While other doctors took the Hippocratic Oath seriously, Ishii saw medicine as a weapon, a tool for empire. In the 1920s, Japan was rising. The nation had modernized at breathtaking speed, transforming from a feudal society to an industrial power in just 50 years. But there was a problem. Japan was resource-poor and land-hungry. The military leadership dreamed of an empire spanning all of Asia, a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere under Japanese control. Ishii understood that conventional warfare had limits. Bullets and bombs were expensive. Soldiers could be defeated, but biological weapons. Disease didn't need ammunition. It didn't tire. It didn't retreat. And most importantly, it was cheap. He became obsessed with the idea. He traveled to Europe in the late 1920s, studying the aftermath of World War I, where chemical weapons had been used with devastating effect. The 1925 Geneva Protocol had banned biological and chemical warfare, but Ishii saw the ban differently. If the world was so afraid of these weapons that they outlawed them, they must be incredibly effective. When he returned to Japan, he presented a proposal to the Imperial Army. Give me resources, give me test subjects, and I will create weapons that will make Japan invincible. The military brass listened, and in 1932, they gave him what he wanted. The location was perfect. Manchuria, the northeastern region of China that Japan had recently invaded and renamed Manchukuo, a puppet state. Far from prying eyes, far from international observers, and most importantly, it had an endless supply of what Ishii needed most: human test subjects. The Japanese occupiers called them maruta, logs, as in logs of wood, a dehumanizing term for Chinese civilians, Soviet prisoners, Korean independence fighters, and anyone else deemed expendable. Men, women, children, pregnant women, entire families. To Ishii and his team, they weren't people, they were raw materials. Construction began on a massive complex near the city of Harbin. From the outside, it looked like an industrial facility. Warehouses, administration buildings, barracks. But inside was a sprawling nightmare. Laboratories, dissection rooms, prison cells, crematoria, and specialized chambers designed for experiments that would make the Nazi doctors look restrained by comparison. By 1936, the facility was fully operational. Unit 731 was born, and the screaming began. Chapter 2: The Experiments. What happened inside Unit 731 is almost impossible to comprehend. Not because the facts are unclear, the documentation is horrifyingly detailed, but because the human mind rejects the idea that doctors, scientists, educated men could do these things to other human beings. But they did, methodically, repeatedly, for over a decade. Vivisection without anesthesia. Ishii wanted to study the effects of diseases on the human body, but he didn't want the data contaminated by medications or the body's natural healing responses after death. So the subjects were cut open while alive, fully conscious. Prisoners were infected with diseases, plague, cholera, anthrax, typhoid, and then, at various stages of infection, they were strapped to tables and dissected. Doctors would cut through skin, muscle, and bone, removing organs one by one to observe how the disease progressed. The victims would be watching their own organs being removed, screaming until their vocal cords gave out or they went into shock. Former Unit 731 member Yoshio Shinozuka gave testimony decades later. He described one vivisection in chilling detail. A Chinese prisoner, infected with plague, strapped down and conscious. The doctors opened his chest, removed his lungs, and observed them still moving, still trying to breathe outside the body. The man was alive for the entire procedure. This wasn't an isolated incident. This was standard protocol. Thousands of vivisections were performed, and because anesthesia was considered wasteful on logs, the victims felt everything. Frostbite experiments. Manchuria is brutally cold in winter. Temperatures regularly drop to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Ishii saw an opportunity. Japanese soldiers fighting in northern China were suffering from frostbite. Ishii wanted to find the most effective treatment. So prisoners were taken outside in the dead of winter, their arms forcibly exposed to the freezing air. Some were doused with water first to accelerate freezing. Technicians would periodically strike the frozen limbs with sticks. When the arms made a sound like hitting a wooden plank, the frostbite was considered complete. Then, the victims were brought inside for treatment testing. Some had their frozen arms plunged into boiling water, others into warm water. Others were placed near fires. The researchers meticulously documented which methods caused the flesh to rot fastest, which caused the most pain, which allowed for potential recovery. If a subject's arm fell off during testing, they simply repeated the experiment on the other arm, or the legs, or the face. Children were not exempt. There are documented cases of infants being subjected to frostbite experiments. Efficiency, you see, smaller bodies froze faster. Pressure chamber experiments. What happens to the human body in extreme pressure changes? Ishii wanted to know. Prisoners were sealed in airtight chambers. The air pressure was slowly increased until their eyes popped out of their skulls. Or it was rapidly decreased until their internal organs ruptured and exploded outward. Some subjects survived long enough for their intestines to be forced out of their bodies by the pressure differential before they finally died. All of this was filmed, photographed, documented, because it was science. Weapon testing. Unit 731 wasn't just studying disease, they were weaponizing it. Plague-infected fleas were bred by the billions in special incubators. They were packed into ceramic bombs designed to shatter on impact, releasing clouds of infected insects over Chinese cities. Between 1940 and 1942, these bombs were dropped on cities like Ningbo, Changde, and Kuzhou. The results were catastrophic. Entire cities were infected. Plague spread uncontrollably. Estimates suggest that biological attacks killed at least 400,000 Chinese civilians, possibly many more. And because the Japanese army didn't warn their own troops, Japanese soldiers also died from the diseases they'd unleashed. But Ishii didn't care. He had his data: rape and forced pregnancy. Female prisoners were raped, sometimes by guards, sometimes by other prisoners at gunpoint, to study the effects of venereal diseases and pregnancy on disease progression. Pregnant women were infected with syphilis, then vivisected at various stages of pregnancy to observe how the disease passed to the fetus. Infants were removed from wombs and dissected. Some babies were born in Unit 731 cells. They didn't live long. They were too valuable as research subjects. Chapter 3. The Human Cost. The testimonies from survivors, and there were very, very few, paint a picture of hell on Earth. One rare survivor, a Chinese teenager who escaped during a moment of chaos, described the prison cells: concrete boxes, unheated in the Manchurian winter, barely large enough to lie down in. Prisoners were fed just enough to keep them alive for experiments. Waste accumulated in the corners. Disease was rampant even before the intentional infections. He described hearing the screams from the laboratories, hearing people begging for death in Chinese, Russian, Korean, Mongolian, hearing the sudden silence when the experimenters got annoyed and simply killed the subject to continue working in peace. Former Unit 731 staff gave post-war testimonies that are almost worse because of their casual tone. One technician described vivisections as routine work, like butchering a pig. Another described incinerating bodies, and complained that children's bones didn't burn as efficiently as adults, clogging the furnaces. These were educated men, doctors, many had families. They went home at night, had dinner, played with their children, and returned the next morning to cut open living human beings. The psychological dissonance is staggering, but it's explainable: dehumanization. By calling victims logs, by treating them as experimental materials rather than people, the staff could compartmentalize. Add in nationalist propaganda, these weren't Japanese citizens, they were enemies of the empire, and a culture of absolute obedience to authority, and you create a system where atrocity becomes routine. By the time the war ended, Unit 731 had killed an estimated 10,000 to 12,000 people through direct experimentation. But the biological weapons they developed and deployed killed hundreds of thousands more across China. Chapter 4. The Cover-Up. August 1945. The atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Soviet Union declared war on Japan and began advancing into Manchuria. The war was over. Japan was defeated. Shiro Ishii knew what was coming. The Soviets would reach Harbin within days. And if they found Unit 731, if the world learned what had been done there, he gave the order: destroy everything. Prisoners still alive in the cells were executed, shot, poisoned, or locked inside and burned alive. The experimental data was boxed up and shipped to Japan. Buildings were dynamited. Mass graves were dug, and corpses were burned in enormous pyres. The crematoria ran day and night. The staff smashed laboratory equipment, poured chemicals over records, detonated entire wings of the complex. By the time Soviet forces arrived, Unit 731 was a smoking ruin. Some documentation survived. Some prisoners, barely alive, were found in the rubble and gave testimony. But the full scope of the operation remained hidden. The key personnel, Ishii and his top scientists, fled to Japan. They waited for the inevitable war crimes trials. They knew they would be arrested, tried, and likely executed, just like the Nazi doctors at Nuremberg. But the arrest never came. Chapter 5. The Devil's Bargain. Here's where the story takes a turn that makes everything worse. The United States government made a deal with the devil. As American occupation forces took control of Japan, U.S. intelligence officers learned about Unit 731. They interrogated captured staff. They examined the surviving documentation, and they realized something that changed everything. The data was invaluable. No Western power had conducted human experiments on this scale. The Nazis had done horrific experiments, but nothing this systematic. The Soviets were developing their own biological weapons program, and the Cold War was already beginning. The Americans needed an edge. So General Douglas MacArthur's staff made a proposal to Washington: grant immunity to the Unit 731 scientists in exchange for exclusive access to their research data. Keep it secret from the Soviets. Keep it secret from the international tribunals. Just make it disappear. The decision was made at the highest levels. Shiro Ishii and his top researchers were given full immunity from prosecution. They were never charged with war crimes. They were never extradited. They were never even publicly named. In exchange, they handed over their data: detailed reports on plague transmission, frostbite treatment, pressure tolerance, bacteria cultivation, vivisection findings. Thousands of pages of research written in blood. The United States paid them. The exact amount remains classified, but estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of dollars, equivalent to millions today. Blood money for blood research. And then these men went free. Shiro Ishii became a respected businessman. He lived quietly in Tokyo. He gave occasional lectures at medical conferences, never mentioning his past. He died in 1959 at age 67 of throat cancer. Peacefully, in his own bed, surrounded by family. Many of his subordinates went on to prominent careers. They became university professors, pharmaceutical company executives, medical researchers. Some founded Japan's post-war blood banking industry. One became governor of Tokyo. None of them ever faced trial. None of them ever went to prison. None of them ever publicly apologized. The Soviet Union tried. They captured some lower-level Unit 731 staff and held the Khabarovsk war crimes trials in 1949, prosecuting 12 men. But without American cooperation, and without access to the key architects like Ishii, the trials were dismissed by the West as Soviet propaganda. The Chinese government demanded justice. They were ignored. For decades, the official American position was that Unit 731 was exaggerated communist propaganda, that the accounts were fabricated, that nothing on that scale could have happened. Chapter 6. The Truth Emerges. For decades, Unit 731 remained a ghost story, a rumor, something that couldn't be proven because the evidence had been destroyed and the perpetrators protected. But in the 1980s, investigative journalists began digging. Japanese journalists, risking social ostracism, tracked down elderly former Unit 731 staff and convinced some to speak on the record. Chinese researchers excavated mass graves near the Harbin site, finding bones, thousands of bones, showing evidence of vivisection and trauma. In 1984, a Japanese reporter named Akira Yoshimura published Plague Ship, exposing details of biological weapon deployment. In 1989, American historian Sheldon Harris published Factories of Death, compiling decades of research into one devastating account. The evidence became undeniable. The Japanese government could no longer dismiss it as propaganda, but even today, in 2025, Japan has never officially apologized for Unit 731. The Japanese government acknowledges that regrettable incidents occurred, but refuses to provide details, open archives, or compensate victims' families. School textbooks barely mention it. Most young Japanese citizens have never heard of Unit 731. There's a museum now, built by the Chinese government on the site of the original complex. Visitors can walk through reconstructed prison cells, see the remains of the laboratories, view photographs of victims. It's a memorial to people whose names were never recorded, who were killed, dissected, and burned, and whose only monument is a number in a ledger marked "Logs Consumed." Epilogue. The lesson we refuse to learn. Here's the question that haunts this history. How does a doctor become a torturer? Shiro Ishii didn't start his career as a monster. He was a healer. He took an oath to do no harm. So what changed? The answer is uncomfortable. Nothing changed. He was always capable of this. We all are. The Unit 731 staff weren't psychopaths. Psychological evaluations done post-war showed they were normal men. Average intelligence. No unusual sadistic tendencies. They were doctors, researchers, family men who genuinely believed they were serving their country. They were able to commit atrocities because 1. Dehumanization. Victims were called logs, not people. 2. Authority. Orders came from the top. Obedience was paramount. 3. Nationalism. They believed Japan's survival justified anything. 4. Compartmentalization. They separated work from life. 5. Scientific framing, calling it research, made it feel legitimate. Sound familiar? These are the same psychological mechanisms that enabled the Holocaust, the Rwandan genocide, the Khmer Rouge killing fields, every mass atrocity in history. And here's the truly terrifying part: the data was used. American researchers incorporated Unit 731's findings into their own biological weapons programs at Fort Detrick. The frostbite data influenced Korean War medical protocols. The disease research informed Cold War bioweapon development. Evil compounded by pragmatism. Atrocity laundered through utility. The victims of Unit 731 didn't just die, they died for nothing. Their suffering produced knowledge that could have been gained ethically, over time, through legitimate research. But because the shortcut existed, because the data was already there, written in blood, it was used. And the men who tortured them to produce it went free, were paid, and died comfortably. The echo. We like to think we've learned that never again means something. That international law and human rights conventions prevent this now. But Unit 731 wasn't that long ago. Some of the scientists who worked there lived into the 1990s. Their children are still alive. The American officials who granted them immunity, some of them served into the 1970s and 80s. This isn't ancient history. This is living memory. And the precedent it set, that war crimes can be forgiven if the perpetrators have something valuable to offer, that precedent still exists. Operation Paperclip brought Nazi scientists to America for the space program. Intelligence agencies worldwide have made deals with war criminals in exchange for information. The moral calculus hasn't changed. If you're useful enough, you can get away with anything. The victims of Unit 731 have no graves, no headstones. Most don't even have names in the historical record. They were logs, fuel for the machinery of empire, used, burned, and forgotten. But we can remember them. We can speak their story. We can refuse to let this be buried. Because the alternative, the comfortable lie that this was an aberration, a uniquely Japanese evil, something that couldn't happen now, that lie is dangerous. Unit 731 proved that ordinary people, under the right conditions, are capable of extraordinary evil. That education doesn't prevent atrocity. That science without ethics is just systematic cruelty. That obedience without conscience is how hell gets built, brick by people who go home and kiss their children goodnight. The smokestacks of Harbin are gone now. The prison cells are empty. The laboratories are ruins. But the lesson remains, carved in bone and ash. If you like such videos, subscribe and comment about next video.